Well, I think there are a number of reasons why, and I likened it to a perfect storm. Uh, the world's resources are diminishing at a very fast pace. The Arctic is largely unexploited. It holds a lot of fossil fuels. It holds a lot of minerals. And at the same time, the Arctic ice is melting, and those fossil fuels and those minerals are now accessible when they weren't accessible 5 or 10 years ago. And so northern countries now are starting to focus their attention on what's there. Well, there's the United States in the Western Arctic, there's Canada, which has probably one of the biggest stakes next to Russia, and there is Norway and Denmark, which effectively owns Greenland. Well, it's up in the air. That's the interesting thing right now is that boundaries are not clearly defined. Canada, the United States have a disagreement over who owns where the boundary line is between Alaska and the Yukon. The Russians, of course, now are making a play for a large area around the North Pole. The Danes are contesting some waters in the eastern Arctic. And of course, there is international disagreement over whether the Northwest Passage, which cuts through the Canadian archipelago, is actually an international strait or part of Canadian waters. And these are all major issues that have to be settled. Well, I think, the north for Canada is really what identifies Canada from the United States, because both countries are very similar. We speak the same language. We really share the same kind of culture. But the Arctic really is one of those sort of iconic symbols, that we're different. And I think that also economically is extremely important. Canada suddenly realized that its future lies in what lies beneath the Arctic. And so there's this sort of cultural, economic importance that Canadians tied to the Arctic. I think they are. The Russians have got off to a big start when they decided that they were going to use the Northeast Passage as a waterway, and they were also going to exploit the mineral resources and the fossil fuels in that area. And so they've started building up their icebreaker capability. They're way ahead of the game, far past Canada and the United States. And Canada and the United States really are I think, are dithering right now. They can't make up their minds as to how to proceed in the future. The American fleet, the Canadian fleet is all aging. It's very small, limited capabilities. We don't have any ports up in the Arctic. We really are way behind. Well, the U.S. Geological Survey just identified, I think, 100 billion barrels of oil in the Beaufort Sea, which I think is equivalent to about 3 years' supply of oil in the United States. Not a huge amount, but compared to anything else that's available now in the United States, it's massive. That's only one small part of the Arctic. It's yet to be defined what else is up there, but conservative estimates suggest that 40 to 50% of the world's remaining fossil fuels are going to be found within the Arctic region. So really, if you look at it from that point of view, that's the future. And that's why there's so much attention and so much posturing going on right now. The other wild card is that there's something called methane hydrates, which are locked in the ice beneath the permafrost in the Arctic. And there are more methane hydrates, more energy in methane hydrates than there is in all of the energy reserves left in the world. And if they can find a way of commercially extracting that gas from those hydrates, it gives new life to fossil fuels, whether people down south like it or not. And that would be huge. Well, it's funny, people used to talk about 12 to 60 years. Now they're talking about 5 years to 8 years. And I think that's realistic because now we've seen 2 years in a row in which the Arctic has melted to the point where you could navigate from one end of the Arctic to the other without hitting ice in the summertime. And that's only one part of it. The other part of it is that the resources are on the perimeter are already accessible. And that's why Exxon and British Petroleum and Shell and those major companies are already spending billions of dollars just for exploration leases in those perimeters. So I think it's already started, and I think that if they wanted to go there now, they can get it. And really, the Norwegians have already proved that you can do this in extreme areas. They're way ahead of the game with their North Sea operations, and I think that once they bring those to North America, we're going to see accelerated development in the future. Multinationals, I think, it's Exxon has already made a play. I think they spent $750,000 just for the right to explore. I think it was British Petroleum spent, in the order of $1.5 billion recently. Big dollars are being spent on Arctic leases, the right to search for oil in the Arctic. And it's only going to continue because they have nowhere else to go. Well, it's a means by which countries can define their borders within maritime areas. And it's up for negotiation. It allows for, there are certain definitions that are in place, but those definitions, I think, are negotiable. And so the ongoing discussions between all those countries that signed it, it's a progress in evolution, or a project in evolution. And I think that what's really required is the United States to sign on, because the only way the Arctic is actually going to be exploited in a sensible, environmentally friendly way is if all the Arctic countries cooperate. And I think the law of the sea is one means by which they can do that. And until the United States signs on, I think that then it becomes very difficult to define how that cooperation is going to be. Well, I think the decision makers are very much behind public opinion and expert opinion. I think the American military, the Navy in particular, and the Coast Guard are way ahead of the curve. And they understand what the challenges are in the future, and they've defined it in a number of ways, that the United States is really not prepared to deal with what is happening in the Arctic in the future. And there's no end to the number of people who have been saying that. And I think that a number of environmentalists, both on the extreme side and on the conservative side, have also pointed out you have to have a marine protection plan put in place if the Arctic is going to be developed in an environmentally friendly way. And I think that the decision makers still haven't caught on to that. And I think that largely because the Arctic has been out of sight, out of mind, and it hasn't been an imperative for a long, long time. And usually decision makers respond to crises. And I don't think that we can afford a crisis or a crisis in the Arctic for decision makers to act. So I think, they've got to be ahead of the game here, because we really are in unexplored territory. Well, I think the ugliest scenario is an environmental one. Take, for example, a rogue ship carrying a load of crude oil decides to make a run through the Northwest Passage to save several $1 million in time and fuel, and it strikes an iceberg calving off the coast of Greenland, is only damaged, and it continues on and then falls apart somewhere in the Northwest Passage. Really, we have no capability of dealing with a disaster like that. We don't have Valdez, as we did many years ago with the Exxon Valdez disaster, where we could stage a cleanup and recovery. The Arctic has no port, no deep water port. They have very few landing strips. It's a cold weather environment, so it's very difficult to store that oil. Plus you have ice, and you have oil going underneath the ice, and the ice is traveling into the North Atlantic, say into the cod fisheries. You have a huge disaster that would make the Exxon Valdez look like a minor incident. The other one is I think very far into the future, but very real, is that if we don't have the international community cooperating on Arctic, on the defining of Arctic boundaries, the management of the Arctic, as countries do in Antarctica, then you may have the Russians making a play for an area that Canada claims or that Norway claims, and you can have this sort of political instability. I doubt that it's going to become a military outbreak, but it becomes some serious sore points. And how you resolve that, in a friendly manner remains to be seen. Well, there are a number of them. There are the Arctic Council, which is a council of representatives from different Arctic nations that discuss these things and make recommendations to the various governments that they represent. They've largely been ignored, and it's peculiar because the Arctic is such an important place. Canada has a Canadian Polar Commission, which is composed of a body of experts, both from the Aboriginal community, from the university community. They've largely been ignored along the way. No single group has been taken seriously. I think the organizations that are taken most seriously are the ones with a military history. Retired admirals, generals who are now starting to sound the alarm, and their warnings seem to resonate. And you get the World Wildlife Fund has also, I think, got a remarkable Arctic plan, but again has not really resonated with either the American or Canadian governments, or even I think the Norwegian and Russian governments. And so it's I think very frustrating for all parties involved that they've been sounding the alarm for a long time, but no one has really been listening. I think the United Nations has a role to play, but it is such a huge organization that represents so many different countries that I think that its influence here is fairly limited. We're really talking about an area of the world, a very, very large area of the world that's controlled by 4 or 5 countries, and with interest from other countries, of course. But I think it's small enough a group that those countries would probably be most effective in resolving this, because I don't think that the issues are that big that they can't be resolved amicably. Well, that's evolving. They had their first meeting in Denmark, I think it was, a little while ago. I'm not sure about that, about the country. And it's a first start, it's a first step. But I think that there has to be something that's more formal and more permanent. Something along the lines of, what Canada has with the United States with the Free Trade Agreement, where you have dispute mechanism systems, resolving mechanism systems, where if there is a problem, there is a dispute, that there's some body that can decide, say, of the different Arctic nations, that can decide it amicably. Well, you look at Spitsbergen, where the Norwegians own in the North Atlantic, in the Arctic regions. I think India is now the 11th or 12th country which has a research station based there. China has tremendous interest in the Arctic for a variety of reasons, one of them being resources. And so the world really is focused on the Arctic now. It's not just the countries that own the Arctic, it's those countries that are going to benefit from what comes out of the Arctic. And China was very cryptic some time ago by saying that the Arctic belongs to no one, it belongs to the world. And whatever that means, I don't think that no one has challenged them at this point. But it was an interesting comment. But what I think it really demonstrates is that the age of the Arctic really is upon us. It's not just an issue that has to be resolved by the Arctic nations. It's an issue that has to be resolved by the world community. Well, I think it's happening so fast that it's almost impossible to predict. It's like the climate models. that predicted, that the Arctic ice will be Arctic will be ice free in the summertime between 12 and 60 years, and now they're talking between, say, 5 and 12 years. Um, I think we're going to see a lot of oil and gas activity in the Arctic, a lot of staking of claims. I think we will probably see a railway across Baffin Island, the first railway in the Arctic region, transporting iron ore. I think we will see a number of port facilities beginning to be developed. I think we're going to see a lot more tourism in the Arctic, a lot of cruise ship floating through. This is a new destination for a lot of these companies. It used to be Antarctica, but the fact is, if you go through the Arctic, you're probably going to see a lot more than you will in Antarctica, because there's a lot more life there. There are a lot more things to see along the way. And I think it's just going to be a whole new place. It's going to be humming, and I think it's going to kind of be like the start of the exploration of the West. In a generation, it's all going to be over.